Good evening. My name is Sumbul Siddiqui, and this is
Susan Schlesinger.
Yeah, the S's. I wanted to briefly do a welcome on behalf of the city and welcome you to this educational event as part of Affordable Housing Action Month. Last year it was a year, and this year the city said, let's do a month. Maybe next year we'll do it even longer. The goal of today, Susan will talk a little bit more about it, but many of us have talked a lot about affordable housing over the years, and even me who's grown up in affordable housing, I didn't know how it got funded and all the different types of subsidies that are involved, and from there what kind of barriers exist. So we'll hear more about that today. And so thank you so much for coming. I do want to recognize my colleagues on the council, Councilor Simmons, thank you for being here. And then Councilor Craig Kelly in the back, thank you. And then I wanted to thank our IT, Craig and Chris and Calvin over who is recording this. So it will be recorded so that people from years from now can be learning about affordable housing finance, and we can keep watching it over and over.
I'm going to do a brief introduction, just following up on what Sumbul just explained. We're here because we're interested in affordable housing. We want to see more affordable housing in the city. We know there are barriers to producing affordable housing, but we don't all talk the same language because like for instance me, I've been involved in affordable housing production for 30 plus years in the city, on the state level as well. And it's a fairly arcane financial house of cards that we build when we build affordable housing. And so I think we're extremely lucky today to have with us Peter Roth. Peter is a lecturer for over 20 years at both the MIT Real Estate program as well as the Department of Architecture. He began a development company in Boston, that New Atlantic, that produces a range of housing. He's known for mixed income housing, affordable housing, and historic preservation, and also doing service-related housing, so housing for people who have special needs. So he's, I think, uniquely qualified in presenting a 101 on affordable housing. I wanted to just kind of review what the agenda is or how we have the program laid out. Peter's going to go through a slide presentation for somewhere around 45 minutes. And then after, we're going to open up the floor to questions and answers. And these are questions that we'd like you to keep the question to a minute, okay? Because we really want to concentrate on this material tonight, rather than a more ranging discussion of maybe current policy efforts that we've all probably familiar with. But this is really trying to learn some of the nuts and bolts about finance. So I will remind people of that, of what we're trying to do in the question and answer period after Peter's presentation. But I also want to say that we have here tonight members of experts, practitioners from our own Cambridge nonprofit development community. We have people from the Housing Authority, people from Just a Start, and people from Homeowners Rehab. And as probably most people know, about 90%, maybe more, of the housing that we produce, the affordable housing we produce, is produced by our own homegrown, long-standing affordable housing not-for-profits. So without further ado, I give you Peter Roth.
Thank you, Susan. Let me know if I'm not speaking loud enough or you can't hear me. Raise your hand if you can't hear me. You've already cheated because I normally do not hand out my lecture notes before I lecture. So many of you have already read my lecture, and you might be on a digital device doing your other homework or talking to your mother or something. So bear with me. This is a topic about which I'm pretty knowledgeable, but I must say I learn something new every day. It's such a complex field, and there's so much activity going on here locally. In the state of Massachusetts is a wonderful place to try to do affordable housing, but we'll get into this. I think I'm going to stop at a couple points so that you could ask a clarifying question, but we're probably going to reserve the bulk of the Q&A until I've gotten through my 34 or 35 slides. Okay?
Yes.
Great. So, 3 things I'd like to touch on generally. How is affordable housing created and financed? What are the barriers to creating affordable housing? The financing part is just a part of it, and I think it's fair to talk about all of those things as we talk about finance. And then, what are some of the solutions to these barriers? What are some of the ways that people have addressed these challenges, both from a creative subsidy perspective, but also from a policy perspective? Policies occur at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, at the neighborhood level. They all affect development, which is kind of a wide-ranging topic, and I think most people here are pretty passionate about at least one aspect of it. So thanks for coming. So affordable housing is primarily created by using some form of capital subsidy to cover the cost that the income stream from a deed-restricted affordable housing development can support. So just like you have a mortgage, if you're a homeowner, you know that you've got a mortgage, you put a down payment together. Based on the interest rates, you know how much you can borrow based on your income. It's all about capital when we're producing affordable housing, because we are restricting the income to the level that people can afford to pay. We have, pretty high operating expenses and not a lot left over for that mortgage payment. So we'll focus a fair amount on capital subsidies. In general, at sort of all levels of government, rents are considered to be affordable if they take no more than 30% of a household's gross income. Okay, so that's all the members of the household. 30% of that gross income allocated toward housing burden. Now, we have people here in Cambridge and the Boston SMSA who are paying 60, sometimes even 70% of their gross household income toward housing. And this is a problem statewide. For homeownership, it's a similar metric, but with homeownership, you have a mortgage, so you're paying principal and interest payments to your mortgage lender. You're also paying real estate taxes, insurance, and if that homeownership option happens to be a condo, you're also paying condo fees. So if you add those things up, and we used to call it PITI, now we call it PITIC, to capture that condominium fee, which is not optional. That should not be more than 30 to 35% of a household's gross income for you to be able to afford all the other things that you need, from transportation to healthcare to education, etc. So those are kind of the standards that we use when we think about connecting households to housing that they can afford. So levels of affordability are typically indexed and described by the Department of Housing and Urban Development and adopted by all state levels, but it's helpful to know what some of those levels of affordability are and how people think about that. So, and everything is indexed to the area median income for the statistical area that you're in. For the Boston SMSA, we're talking about Greater Boston. So not only the city of Boston, the city of Cambridge, city of Arlington, Watertown, but the relatively affluent suburbs around Boston. And right now, the median income for a household of 4 in the Boston SMSA is over $107,000. it's over $107,000, which is pretty high. So everything's indexed to that, that area median income. What we call extremely low income households earn up to 30% of that AMI. And that typically covers, people who are on public assistance, people that are on SSI, the chronically disabled, formerly homeless people that may have no income whatsoever. They're considered very low, extremely low income. Very low income is up to 50% of AMI, which, for a household of 4 would be just over $50,000. Still seems like a fair amount of money, but it's considered very low income by these metrics that we work with in the industry. Low income, which is the threshold for using a very important program we'll talk more about, the low income housing tax credit, is 60% of AMI. Moderate income is up to 80% of AMI. Middle income is up to 100%. And then there's this new thing called workforce housing. It's been around forever, but we just now have some labels and are focused on the fact that even people earning up to 120% of area median income can often not afford to find a home in these really high cost places like Boston and Cambridge. So, just to look at those thresholds. And if you look at what that means in terms of household incomes right now in Boston SMSA, you can look at this chart. So, and it's indexed by how many people are in the household. In theory, as you have more people in the household, you have more potential for income within that household. And when you're looking at, certifying a household's income, you're looking at the income from every member of that household. So everywhere from a one-person household at 30% AMI, who could have an income as high as $22,650, up to a 4-person household at, say, 60% AMI, which is the typical tax credit unit maximum of a little over $64,000, way up to a 5-person household, family with 3 or 4 kids, at 120% of AMI, which is the highest level for which generally there are resources in the affordable housing financing world. But that household could make almost $140,000. And a unit serving that household could still be eligible for support. You'll see why in a minute when we look at the kind of capital that these projects can support. If you also look at what the maximum rents are that are derived from that 30% housing burden metric for all those households, and now you're converting sort of household to apartment size or dwelling unit size, going from a studio to a 4-bedroom, you'll see that theoretically that one-person household that lives in a studio at 30% AMI could afford to pay $542. Now this would be the maximum rent set at, a maximum eligible income. Most people are not at that maximum rent, so they're already housing burdened if they're at, say, 22 or 25 or 28% of AMI, and so forth. And you can see that a 4-bedroom apartment for a 30% AMI family of 4 or 5 or 6 could pay up to $900. Typically here in Cambridge, affordable rents are set substantially lower than the maximum rent. Okay, and Cambridge is a little special in that they actually try to establish rents for particularly inclusionary affordable housing based on a household's actual income, which is a little different than the way the privately owned system works. So that you can get a sense of what rents are based on 2018 statistics about area median income and the derived rents that HUD calculates that all of the actors in our industry use. So everybody refers to these income charts and these rent charts as they're thinking about affordable housing and particularly developing affordable housing. So when you're creating market rate housing, you're thinking about how much capital a project can attract based on the rents you can charge, less the operating expenses that you think you will incur operating that piece of real estate, and then the cost of capital. So everybody probably knows that if interest rates are high, you can borrow less. If interest rates are low, like they have been historically the last 10 or 12 years, you can borrow a lot more. If interest rates go up, say from 4% to 5%, you have 25% less purchasing power in the housing market. So interest rates are really important, and they're probably the easiest thing we have to assess the cost of capital. You know, capital comes from a bunch of different sources, but generally the cost of capital is the way that we can evaluate how much we could afford to invest in a real estate project based on our rents, our operating expenses, and the cost of capital. You do the same thing if you're trying to develop affordable housing, but guess what? If you're targeting lower income households, you're reducing the rent. Your operating expenses are similar, if not more, depending on the nature of the affordable housing. Service enrichment housing and other special needs housing is often very expensive to operate. But based on the deed restricted rents that you can charge, you can't support a lot of capital. So we have a gap, and that's the challenge of affordable housing. You good so far? Okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
You're talking about AMI, and you're talking about like 3 people in the household. But it seems like 3 people could be 2 adults and 1 child, or it could be 1 adult and 2 children.
Yep.
And very different, but they're all classified in the same group. I don't understand that.
Well,
Please
to
repeat
make
the
regulations,
question.
you have to.
Please
So
repeat.
the question was, if you're talking about, say, a 3-person household at a certain percent of AMI, you know, there could be dramatically different households. It could be a single parent with 2 children, or it could be, you know, 2 working people. It could even be 3 working people. It could be a couple with a, you know, with a parent. All 3 of them earning income. So yes, there can be very different makeup within a household size, and the challenge of working with the statistical thresholds that we all have to work in is that, you know, you have to organize the world of finance in some form or fashion, but recognizing that that's the case. But you're also looking at the total household income that that household earns as you're thinking about, you know, how much housing they can afford. So I'll take one more question and then move on. Yes?
Just clarifying, I think we're gonna be able to everyone that signed in, email your presentation, is that right? And therefore, people don't have to worry about capturing the details?
Yes, there are copies, and I think we're videotaping. We're going to integrate a copy of this with the videotape file, and that will all be available in an online resource. And there are many copies of this floating around. So, but feel free to raise your hand if you have a qualifying question. So let's look at sort of comparing an affordable unit targeting a household at 60% of area median income, which is a common target in the affordable housing industry because at the 60% AMI level, you can use the largest resource available to developers of affordable rental housing, and that's the federal low-income housing tax credit. And let's compare that 60% AMI unit to a market rate unit, okay? Current market unit. So if it's a 2-bedroom unit, a 60% AMI, a 2-bedroom can charge no more than $456 a month in rent. A similar apartment in the open market could capture $3,600 or more in rent, depending on the quality and its location. To figure out how much capital we can support, you first subtract utilities, because when HUD sets a regulated rent based on that 30% housing burden, they're assuming that that 30% covers all of the housing related expenses, including utilities. So if a developer isn't, setting up his housing project to pay for all the utilities, then he can only charge a certain amount of rent that is the maximum established rent less utilities. HUD also publishes a very detailed schedule of operating expenses. So everybody calculates, what utilities the tenant will be paying out of their own pocket, and you have to adjust that rent accordingly. Now, almost all market rate units, the tenant is paying all the utilities. Here in Massachusetts now, you can even pass through the cost of water and sewer expenses to individual tenants. So in the market, just about everything except maybe water and sewer is paid by the tenant. So we have an adjusted gross income per month. We turn that into an annual figure. We calculate a factor for vacancy when we're sort of going through this capitalization process. And then we subtract the operating expenses that we think we will incur managing and taking care of this piece of real estate. And they're anywhere from $8,000 to $14,000 a unit a month, depending. We tend to use $9,500 for a well-managed, well-maintained, affordable housing environment. That same market rate unit, two-bedroom unit at market rate, will have higher operating expenses for the one significant reason that their real estate taxes will be higher, because the unit is inherently worth more, because it can charge market rents. The deed restricted 60% of AMI unit is restricted by deed as to how much income it can receive, and therefore, if the assessor is doing their homework correctly, they'll recognize that deed restriction, and that unit will not be assessed for as much as a market rate unrestricted unit. So you've got $9,500 a unit a year for a 60% AMI unit, maybe $11,500 or $12,000 for a market rate unit, generating net operating income of between $5,800 for the 60% AMI unit, and a lot more, $29,000, $29,500 for a market rate unit. And if you take that income stream and you take it to the capital markets, right now the capital markets, are averaging capital at about 5%. You can get capital for the 60% AMI two-bedroom unit of about $116,000 and almost $600,000 for a two-bedroom market rate unit.
Can you just explain that last thing?
Yes. So she said, explain that last thing, and that's how you take an income stream and turn it into an amount of capital that income stream can support. So one way of thinking about it is, if you can borrow money at 5% and you had that much revenue to service debt at 5%, you could service $116,000 at 5%. We call it capitalization in the housing markets. Capitalization is a common financing technique that's used for valuing public companies, valuing private companies. You're basically taking the income stream generated by that asset, whatever it is, literally dividing that income stream by the current average cost of capital related to that kind of asset, and you get a valuation for that asset, okay? So if interest rates are higher and the cost of capital is higher, the valuations are lower. If interest rates are lower and capital costs are lower, you can derive a much higher valuation. And part of the reason we're seeing, this incredible bulge in real estate values is that we've been in a relatively low interest rate environment. People can borrow a lot of money. People can borrow a lot of money to buy a house. They can borrow a lot of money to, get a construction loan and a permanent loan to create a real estate project. If interest rates go up, their buying power, their capital acquiring power will go down. So all of this is very interest rate sensitive, and capital markets are a big factor in housing prices generally. Does that make sense? Okay.
Is it that that's how much if you were to just fund a project through private market, that's how much you could borrow for an affordable unit versus how much you could potentially borrow and leverage for a market rate unit?
Well, every market has its own, special factors that affect the capitalization rates. But generally, capital is pretty fluid these days. And so generally, a well-managed, well-promoted affordable housing project can attract the same amount of capital per dollar of net operating income that the market rate project can. Now, in some cases, market rate projects can attract even more capital based on the fact that now there are a lot of publicly traded long-term owner-operators of rental housing. And the capital markets are providing capital at even lower rates than the debt market is, which makes the sale of a nice market rate asset particularly attractive right now, because capital markets have matured. We have publicly traded housing REITs, real estate investment trusts, that hold a lot of rental real estate in this country, and they can attract capital at very attractive rates. So,
Are you saying that if I were to build an affordable housing unit with 10 two-bedroom, I could attract 10 times 116,440 for that project? Is that basically
in
what you're
theory,
saying?
if interest rates were between 4 and 5%.
Right, based on your number there. So,
Yeah.
so it's 116,440 per two-bedroom unit in a project that you would be going out and raising capital to build.
That's right.
Okay.
But here's the thing. It costs us about $500,000 to build a two-bedroom apartment in the Boston metro area right now.
Somebody's making
It's
a
an
big profit.
appalling, it's an appalling statistic. But you've seen land values and home values in your own neighborhoods. I was talking to a person here that said, she bought her house in Cambridgeport for $30,000, and suddenly it's worth over $1 million. So land prices are a huge driver. But construction costs have escalated on average between 7 and 10% for the last 6 or 7 years, all while interest rates have been low and we've had relatively easy access to capital. Okay? So if it costs me $500,000 to build a good quality affordable housing, 60% AMI two-bedroom apartment, I have a capital gap of over $380,000 because I can only, borrow and service about $116,000 worth of debt, but it's going to cost me $500,000 to build it, to buy land, go through the permitting process, carry the property, build it, pay all the soft costs and interest, operate it. On the market side, I've got a whole lot more net operating income to go to the capital markets with. And I can easily attract almost $600,000. And even if it costs me the same $500,000 to build, I've got a pretty good profit built in at those capital rates. And interest rates will go up, and both markets will be affected similarly by higher costs of capital. Interest rates could go down, and both markets would benefit similarly from lower cost of capital. Clarifying question? Yep.
Yeah, could you just say a word about the 500,000? Is that specifically for here? Is that sort of a number that you're using as an example? Is it,
I would say that that is the average cost that we're seeing in the affordable housing production environment in Boston, Cambridge, basically, the middle of the SNSA. And we're seeing a lot higher than that as well. So that's kind of an average cost to create a new unit, from dirt to the paint on the walls. Yes?
Yes, to what extent does that in Cambridge include adherence to LEED or green standards?
Well, it includes all the construction costs associated with building. But if you think about, what we're looking at here, what can you affect in how you build to make a difference in this formula?
Utilities for one.
You can do as much as you can to reduce utilities, right? What else can you do? You can do as much as you can to create a building that's going to be easy to operate and will last longer, so using really durable materials. If you can build a building that has the ability to capture the sun and create electricity, you can reduce your operating expenses. So affordable housing developers, really all developers, but especially affordable housing developers, focus on operating expenses obsessively. And if you think about, building to a LEED standard, we're doing that for a reason. Because that will lower our operating expenses long term and help this be a stable, well-managed asset for a long time. Okay? Does that make sense? Sometimes you have to invest a little more up front to keep your operating expenses low, but it's better than investing in, dog washes and, pet terraces and the kinds of things that you see in market rate housing. I mean, it's nice to have a place to wash your dog in your apartment building, but doesn't it make more sense to invest in things that are going to make for a durable, healthy, clean air, no outgassing from the materials used, good materials that will last a long time, and that same $500,000 cost might also be for a unit that's a little smaller on the market rate side, a unit that might have a lot of glitzy amenities but probably isn't as well built, because in that environment you're basically seeing merchant builders build, get the property leased up, and then selling it into these very attractive capital markets, with historically low capital rates. They're making a ton of money. So they have more or less a short-term perspective at the development level. Now the firms that are investing for the long term, that are buying those, are as interested in the operating expenses as the affordable housing developers. But you can see that the structure of the industry tends to dictate different behaviors at the development level, and what people really want to invest in long term. We'll take two questions and then we'll move on. Yes, sir.
When you talk about capital markets, does that simply mean like finding people who have money who, instead of wanting to put that money in a savings account, want to put it in a building?
Essentially, yes. I mean, when you invest in, for example, a life insurance policy, or you invest in an annuity with John Hancock or any insurance company, You know, you're basically purchasing a very long-term financial instrument. And those are the kinds of people that provide long-term capital for real estate holds, because they're matching the term of the capital that they can gather, which is the insurance premiums that you pay regularly over 20, 30 years, with the kind of loans that they're making, which are long, 20, 30-year permanent mortgages that finance housing projects or any kind of real estate, really. Does that make sense? Yes.
Do you have comparative costs if you were to build on affordable housing on city property, like on a parking lot, and or to increase the density or height on current affordable housing projects? How much would it decrease the
Well, you could just imagine that if you have lower costs, and we'll talk about costs in a minute, we'll talk about all kinds of costs. If you have lower costs in any of the major cost centers of a project, you're going to benefit because that $500,000 could go down. If you have acquisition costs that are significantly below the market, maybe you can build for $450,000 a year, and attract a little bit more capital and be less reliant on subsidies.
Hey folks, I really appreciate the questions and answers, but there's a Q&A after the presentation. So just to kind of keep cruising through the slides and if at all possible, just hold your questions.
Okay.
Thanks.
So we figured out what our cap is and what the challenge is. So we know that if we want to serve this 4-person or 3-person 2-bedroom household earning 60% of AMI or $58,620 a year or less, we've got to find $380,000 of capital, subsidy, that we don't have any way to service, right, because we don't have any income left. We have to use rent subsidies to increase the rent somehow, or we need to find a way to reduce our costs significantly. And we've already started leading in some of the directions. So let's now shift gears a little bit and talk about general barriers to affordable housing, because it's not just costs and it's not just the complexity of financing, it's a bunch of other stuff too, and I think it's fair to put all these things into context. Competition for land, we know about, we'll talk about each of these. Permitting risk, particularly something that developers hate, it's permitting risk, because it's unpredictable. High costs, which we know we have, construction costs, but other costs as well. Competition for subsidies. So those things that could close that gap, guess what? There's an affordable housing crisis all over the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and in fact, in most parts of this country right now. So imagine the competition for the limited amount of subsidies that are out there at every level, from the federal government down to the city and the local foundations that might want to support housing. Economic variables that, like interest rates, are going to change over time. And then got an interesting slide on unintended consequences of other policies we'll get to. So competition for land in Cambridge, housing or land prices generally have escalated 400% in 15 years. Oh my God. Just let that sink in. Okay. Developers are now paying $200,000 or more for the right to build a dwelling unit on a piece of property. And that's crazy. 15 years ago, it was a quarter of that, $50,000 to $75,000 per allowable unit. And you tend to buy land based on what the zoning allows you to build. On a per unit basis, you kind of look at your zoning and you look at the number of dwelling units that you can build given the dimensional restrictions and the FAR and setbacks and everything. And you figure out, how many dwelling units you can get on a piece of land, and that's connected to how much you can afford to pay for the land. But this is what we're looking at right now, and it's mind-boggling. So permitting risk, what does that really mean? Well, the worst of it is uncertainty. Because if you're competing to pay for land, and if you can permit just a little bit more housing, get a special permit, or the way the inclusionary structure here in Cambridge has been set up, you kind of have an incentive that goes along with that bonus floor area that you get to include inclusionary units, but everybody's trying to lower their cost per unit by getting as many units as they can on that piece of land. It just makes sense if you're doing market rate housing, or if you're trying to use scarce resources and build affordable housing. So the uncertainty associated with permitting risk is really a hard thing to deal with, and something to really focus on from a policy perspective. Carrying costs. If you buy a piece of property in a competitive market and you say it takes you a year or 2 years to get it permitted, you've got carrying costs associated with that permitting period, which just increase the cost of the land. If you're in a contentious process and you have to redesign your project 2 or 3 times to get the permits that you need, you might have redesign costs. You certainly are going to have legal costs associated with that, and if you're appealed, your legal costs can be sky high, and possibly tank a project. And especially in the affordable world, it's a challenge because you can't apply for subsidies at the state level until you have your permits pretty much in hand. If you need a special permit, they're really not going to look seriously at your application until you have that special permit in hand, or the vote's been taken at the city council or the board of appeal or whatever. And because there's so much competition, they don't have to. They've got lots of projects they can fund, so they're funding shovel-ready projects. We heard this back in back in 2009 and 2010 when the federal government was trying to put money into projects to get them moving, and the money went to the projects that were ready to roll. It's the same thing in the affordable housing environment. So high costs, we'll talk a lot about capital costs, but we also want to talk about operating costs. When zoning codes essentially charge you for parking at grade or above grade, and you've got such high land costs that you need to make every square foot of the building you're going to build generate revenue, and you're forced to put parking in a structure either above grade or below grade, that cost is significant too. So parking is increasingly a big component, especially in land-starved areas where there's just not a lot of opportunity to build. But we really focus a lot on operating expenses, and the 3 big ones are utilities, real estate taxes, and maintenance. So again, if we can do something to reduce real estate taxes, if we can invest in a building that's less expensive to maintain, and if we can invest in photovoltaic array or better insulation or better windows to reduce our operating costs, it makes sense over the long run. Just like if you're going to look at a lighting upgrade, you're going to think about how much electricity you'll save over what period of time, and you'll then have a sense of how much you're willing to pay. Competition for subsidies. We're going to talk more about subsidies in a minute, but right now the big kahuna in rental housing affordable development is the low-income housing tax credit. In Massachusetts, it's oversubscribed 3 to 1. So there are 3 times as many requests for tax credits as there are tax credits that are available to allocate to worthy projects. So, they're allocating them once a year. It always used to be twice a year. If you miss that award cycle, you're just going to be cooling your heels for a year until you can apply, and then wait your turn, because there are a bunch of qualified shovel-ready projects ahead of you. Plus, the competition for subsidies is such that the state puts a limit on how much they will give you per funding source, per unit. It's $50,000 a unit for most subsidy sources. But routinely, the state's trying to produce as much affordable housing as they can, and so they're, committing forward funding, and they're running out of subsidy. Here in Massachusetts, we have one of the best infrastructures in the country for creating resources for affordable housing. It's a great place to try to do this work. But we're looking at such high costs, it's a real challenge. Then there are economic variables. We talked about interest rates. But when Lehman Brothers collapsed and the whole world fell apart in the financial markets, guess what happened? There wasn't a single investor out there that would pay for a tax credit, because nobody knew if they were going to have taxable income. The tax credit's only valuable if you have tax liability to offset with that credit. So that market disappeared overnight. And then there are the unintended consequences of other policies. Made a big deal about tax reform and reducing corporate taxes. Well, guess what? Corporations are the largest investors in the low-income housing tax credit. So when you reduce corporate tax rates from 35% to 20%, guess what happened to the value of the tax credit? This chart shows you what happened to credits as tax reform was passed. We lost over 15% of the value of the tax credit, making this work even harder. But let's go back to that example, okay? So we left off knowing that we either had to find $380,000 in subsidy, or maybe we could find some rent subsidies to increase our rents, support more capital, reducing the amount of subsidies that we need, or we try to reduce that cost. So here is a kind of a brief synopsis of the kind of capital subsidies that are available both from the federal government, the state, and locally here in Cambridge. The big one is the federal low-income housing tax credit. It's allocated locally by state agencies. In Massachusetts, it's allocated by the Department of Housing and Community Development, DHCD. They allocate that in accordance with a qualified allocation plan that they come up with every year. And it's a very complicated program because it wasn't designed by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, where housing policy is made in this country. Guess where the low-income housing tax credit lies from a regulatory perspective? The Internal Revenue Service. Now, they care a lot about affordable housing at the service. Section 42 of the Internal Revenue Code governs the low-income housing tax credit, and it is so complicated that there is this whole raft of specialized accountants and lawyers that know how to work with the low-income housing tax credit program, which is incredibly complicated, but it's incredibly important. The 9% low-income housing tax credit was designed to support 70% of the cost of an affordable unit at 60% of area median income or below. So that's a lot. Unfortunately, the need to spread that resource, across a broad political jurisdiction, and high costs, and other sort of political decisions that have made along the way make the tax credit program a lot less valuable than it was intended to be. There are other federal grants. They're typically for targeted populations like the elderly or special needs or neighborhood revitalization through a program called Neighborhood Choice. And the amount of money that's been going into those programs has been bleeding away from the federal budget for almost a decade. At the state level, as I said, we have a very progressive state government that has created a bunch of programs that help. The state receives federal home dollars that it allocates to affordable housing projects. The state created a bond-funded program called Housing Stabilization that mirrors the federal home program and provides a lot of capital for affordable housing. We have a program called CATNIP, the Commercial Area Transit Node Housing Program, trying to focus on the fact that it makes sense to develop affordable housing near transit resources, because maybe people won't have to pay so much for transportation, and they'll have more money if we give them affordable housing and access to transit. They'll have money for medical needs and education and the like. There's a fund called the Housing Innovation Fund that funds a whole bunch of projects that innovate in some way, including supported senior housing, limited equity cooperatives, programs for the elderly. There's a fund for clients of the Department of Developmental Services and clients of the Department of Massachusetts Mental Health. So the Facilities Consolidation Fund was created when we closed all the state hospitals and brought all those people into community residential settings. And it's a fairly attractive program, but it's targeted toward a very focused population. There's a community-based housing program that's focused on clients of the Mass Rehab Commission, permanently disabled people. There's the workforce housing program, which is one of the newest programs that's trying to serve this sort of what they call the missing middle, right? There's money for market rate housing, and there's a fair number of resources for, low income housing, but there's nothing for people in the middle, kind of between 80% and 120% of AMI. So that's the newest program. There's a state affordable housing trust that is funded both from the legislature and from Mass Housing. There's a program specifically for housing targeted at homeless families called Home Funders. That's a very innovative program involving a lot of private capital and foundation capital. And Massachusetts created its own housing tax credit that somewhat mirrors the federal credit. Again, thinking of ways that they could use public resources here in Massachusetts to fuel the production of affordable housing. Then locally, Cambridge gets an allocation of home money from the federal government because it's a large, well-organized city, as does Boston. CDBG, Community Development Block Grant funds, are also allocated to the city of Cambridge. CDBG and Home have been, really experienced reduced funding over the last decade or so. And then Cambridge has a very strong affordable housing trust that takes revenue from commercial projects. It takes other kinds of resources and turns around and invests in affordable housing. So, yeah, there are lots of programs, but as you can see, many of them are very targeted towards special populations. And almost all of them have a per unit limit of $50,000. They also have a per project cap. So if we're trying to get $380,000 for a unit at 60% AMI, how many sources do we have to layer on top of one another to get there? We talked about overallocation. Competition is fierce. Even shovel-ready projects often wait 2 to 3 years to get their funding. And that's after they've gotten their permits and they're pretty much ready to complete their construction documents, bid the project, and start construction. So it's crazy. To give you a specific example of the layering of all those subsidies, many of you might know the Putnam Green project, which is a 100% affordable project here in Cambridgeport on Putnam Street, developed by Homeowners Rehab, completed 5 years ago. Really nice project, high sustainability features, really healthy environment, photovoltaic resources. I think there's even a solar hot water heating system, but it's a really well-built project. And here are all the sources of funding required to pay for this project. 3 layers of local funding, plus at that point the Cambridge Housing Authority had some Section 8 availability, which is an important rent subsidy program that has pretty much gone by the wayside because the federal government isn't adding to the Section 8 resources while rents are going up and up and up. You can look at this list and imagine how complicated it is to get all these lenders and all these capital providers and all these grant sources to agree on documents and close the project and start construction. It's formidable. It's also a lot of fun if you like complexity. When I started my career, I was lucky enough to go to MIT in the School of Architecture, and then I was in the first class of the real estate program. And a friend of mine in my class went to work for Boston Properties, big, important commercial developer. And I was closing my second tax credit project, which was going to be the first fully affordable assisted living facility in the Boston metro area. And he was closing 111 Huntington, the newest office, or the second newest office building in the Prudential Center. And we're talking about what our daily lives are like. And I said, well, I'm trying to herd 14 different lenders into closing and being able to go forward. This closing process is 3 months into it. We're still not closed. And he said, well, I'm closing 111 Huntington. I have one construction loan, and I call up the front office to get a check for the equity that we need to go into the project before the construction lender will fund, and we're off and running. It takes about 2 weeks. So I think my work is a lot more interesting and challenging than his work, but his assets are a lot bigger. Make a lot more money. So we can get capital subsidies. We can also pursue rent subsidies. And rent subsidies are really important, especially for very low-income units and low-income units, because the rental income is so low that it barely covers operating expenses. Okay? So now the big rent subsidy program is the federal Section 8 program that's administered locally by housing authorities. You're very lucky here in Cambridge. You have one of the best performing public housing authorities in the country. They've done some of the most innovative work and have the best track record. So if there are ever any spare resources lying around the country in the federal Section 8 program, chances are Cambridge will get a good shot at them. But they're not putting money into the program anymore at the federal level. So while Putnam Green got a Section 8 project-based commitment, that's not happening anymore. So Massachusetts, being the great stewards of this affordable housing world, created a similar program called the Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program, MRVPs. And this is a rent subsidy program, very much like Section 8, that is paid for by bond funding at the state level. And it increases the amount of rent that can be charged on an otherwise deed-restricted unit. So if you have low-income housing tax credits and you don't have a rent subsidy, you're restricted to charging those rents that are set by the 30% housing burden based on 60% of AMI, and you can't charge any more. If you have a rent subsidy, you can get 30% of the household income toward rent, and you can get the rest from the subsidy provider up to what HUD describes as fair market rent. And fair market rents are a lot higher, especially right now. We've gone through this challenge with HUD in the Boston and Cambridge area to get them to really recognize how incredibly high market rents are. And so for the first time, fair market rents are actually beginning to look a little bit more like real market rents. So for a one bedroom, a fair market rent deemed by HUD is $1,800. A two bedroom rent is $29.94. That's about what, $600, $700 more than the 60% AMI deed restricted rent. So rent subsidies can really help if they are project-based rent subsidies, which means there's a contract between a property owner who has affordable housing and a subsidy provider, like the Cambridge Housing Authority, or in this case, the state of Massachusetts, the MRVP program. Because if you have a contracted rent stream, you can take that rent contract and borrow more money. You can capitalize, you can generate more capital with that higher income. So if we're comparing, say, that 60% AMI unit to a unit that has MRVPs at the HUD fair market rent, and sorry for the acronyms here, but you're probably catching up with some of them. We've got substantially more rent. Utilities are the same. Vacancy factor is still 5%. Our operating expenses are about the same. But that rent subsidy enables us to attract about $170,000 more capital. So it's really valuable if you can get it. It's very hard to put enough money into a rent subsidy that is paid out on a monthly basis for 5, 10, 15 years. So the state prioritizes those for the very low-income units and the low-income units, as they should. And that helps you support an average amount of capital for an affordable housing unit, even though you've got a deed restriction and you're committing to rent to households at that very low income level. So rent subsidies can be an important part of the solution, but they're very hard to come by. The other thing you can do is reduce costs, right? So these are the typical development costs that every project will experience. You've got to buy the land, you've got to carry the land while it's being permitted. You've got to design the project, you've got to engineer the project, you've got to build the project, you've got construction costs. They've been escalating as we spoke about. You often have environmental costs. We're in a fully developed environment here. Almost all of the sites that are now available have some degree of environmental challenge on them, and some are heavily polluted. We do have brownfields tax credits here in Massachusetts that can help a little bit, but they can be significant. We have permit fees. For some reason here in Cambridge, they're twice as much as they are across the river in Boston. I haven't figured that out, but they're high. You have legal costs. Some lawyers got to shepherd not one, not two, but about 10 lawyers representing all those funding sources when it comes time to close all that financing. That same lawyer is going to advise you on acquisition, with your contracts, through your permitting process, through the financing process, and it's not an insignificant expense. You have real estate taxes and insurance during the development period, and if you're carrying the land, during the acquisition carrying costs. You've got other soft costs. You've got accounting, other consultants, transportation consultants, environmental consultants, geotechnical consultants. You have title insurance costs. Every one of those sources of funding needs a title insurance policy to go with their funding. You've got financing costs, origination fees for loans, interest during the development period. You have to pay for the lender's lawyer to close the loan. You're probably setting aside some money to help with lease-up. You'll have deficits during lease-up. You'll be operating the property. You might have to start servicing your loans, so you'll have some capitalized reserves. And you'll have developer overhead and fees. People try to make a big deal about these developer fees, but they're controlled by the state. You can go on the state website and see exactly what developers are entitled to. You know, it's around 10% of the non-acquisition cost of the project. But that cost has to support the staff of a very complicated project for at least 3 years, probably 4 years, likely 5 years, sometimes 6 years. And if you get through that whole process and you've managed to keep your budget together, it's a miracle. The developer fee, which you get at the very end of the development after 6 or 7 years, is the source of funding of last resort. And if you've miscalculated and under budgeted your construction contingency, or you had an unexpected event, you may not get that. In my early projects in my career, before I really learned to budget, you know, really well, I routinely had to put a bunch of my fee back. And we're in the process of refinancing a tax credit project that I closed 16 years ago. I'm finally, after 16 years, getting the last of my developer fee. So these are hard-won dollars. There are real staff costs, real overhead costs. And by the way, if there is some money left over at the end of the day, it's the nonprofits here in Cambridge that are doing this work, and it goes to strengthen that organization. It goes to job training programs. It goes to other, neighborhood benefits. So any way you look at it, their dollars well spent. So, one thing we all think a lot about is, how we could promote policies that could help us reduce cost. And the areas that we think policies could really affect are highlighted here. Certainly land acquisition. If there's publicly owned land that can be used. If there's a zoning incentive that could lower the land cost. Acquisition carrying costs as well. Construction costs can be affected by certain standards. We can talk more about each of these. Permit fees we talked a little bit about. Permitting costs can be affected. And real estate taxes certainly. Real estate taxes and the abatement of real estate taxes has been the single most productive generator of affordable housing in the city of New York for the last 30 years. They had what you might think of as an inclusionary program, but it came with a real estate tax abatement that generated a lot of activity in the affordable housing environment. And it generated tens of thousands of units of affordable housing. Yes, just have a few more slides. So policies that allow for greater density for affordable projects are going to make projects more efficient. They're going to lower their per unit construction costs because a slightly bigger building is a more efficient building on a per square foot and a per unit cost. If we can eliminate or reduce permit fees, that could really help. I don't know that there's ever been any discussion about that, but we always ask. And we're sometimes turned away, but it's twice here in Cambridge. That's what it is in Boston. Real estate tax abatements we talked about. It really reduces operating costs so that we can leverage more debt and pull more capital into the project, reduce the amount of subsidies. Projects that could allow greater density for affordable housing projects can significantly lower acquisition costs. So if we could get the acquisition cost that might be $150,000 or $200,000 a unit down by 25 or 30%, that's worth doing. Because then we'll have more capital subsidies to spread across more units and see more production. So bottom line is this is a really complex business. It's fraught with risk. It's demanding. It's very rewarding. People that do it because they love it. And, it creates real good in communities. I want to reemphasize that affordable housing projects are leading on quality and particularly on sustainability. That's because there's a super emphasis on reducing operating costs. Better quality, more durable construction means you'll have to invest less over time. And a higher degree of energy efficiency and resource utilization is generally going to lower your operating expenses and make for a more sustainable long-term asset. And we're also generating long-term results. I talked about the fact that most market rate apartment developers are doing it to develop it, lease it up, and then sell it. Affordable housing developers, by and large, are bound to long-term affordability. In order to get those competitive subsidies, they're probably committing to affordability in perpetuity to the state, not just the 30-year minimum, but you get points in the scoring system if you commit to longer and longer terms of affordability. There's less turnover in affordable housing unit. I think in the market rate right now, the average tenure is about 1.5 years. In affordable housing, it's 4, 5, sometimes 10 years. I have a project where I think it's 36 low-income units, and about 1/3 of the people that moved in when I first developed it are still there. And there's stable ownership over time. You know these organizations, they're committed to being in the community for a long time. So a shameless plug for affordable housing, especially the way it's done here in Cambridge, primarily by the nonprofit organizations that you know that have been here for a long time. So that's the today's lecture. Now we're ready for some questions.